Christian contraction in Asia and Africa. How had Christianity become, by 1500, a largely European faith, with its earlier and promising Asian and African communities diminished, defeated, or dissolved? The answer, in large measure, was Islam. The wholly unforeseen birth of yet another monotheistic faith in the Middle East, its rapid spread across much of Afro-Eurasian world, the simultaneous creation of a large and powerful Arab empire, the emergence of a cosmopolitan and transcontinental Islamic civilization, these were the conditions, described more fully in Chapter 9, that led to the contraction of Christendom in Asia and Africa, leaving Europe as the principal center of Christian faith. Asian Christianity. It was in Arabia, the homeland of Islam, that the decimation of earlier Christian communities occurred most completely and most quickly, for within a century or so of Muhammad's death in 632, only a few Christian groups remained. During the 8th century, triumphant Muslims marked the replacement of the old religion by using pillars of a demolished Christian cathedral to construct the Grand Mosque of Sana'a in southern Arabia. Elsewhere in the Middle East, other Jewish and Christian communities soon felt the impact of Islam. When expanding Muslim forces took control of Jerusalem in 638 and subsequently constructed the Muslim shrine known as the Dome of the Rock, that precise location had long been regarded as sacred. To Jews, it contained the stone on which Abraham prepared to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice to God, and it was the site of the first 2 Jewish temples. To Christians, it was a place that Jesus had visited as a youngster to converse with learned teachers and later to drive out the money changers. Thus, when the Umayyad Caliph, successor to the Prophet, Abd al-Malik, ordered a new construction on that site, he was appropriating for Islam both Jewish and Christian legacies, but he was also demonstrating the victorious arrival of a new faith and announcing to Christians and Jews that the Islamic State was here to stay. In Syria and Persia, with more concentrated populations of Christians, accommodating policies generally prevailed. Certainly, Arab conquest of these adjacent areas involved warfare, largely against the military forces of existing Byzantine and Persian authorities, but not to enforce conversion. In both areas, however, the majority of people turned to Islam voluntarily, attracted perhaps by its aura of success. A number of Christian leaders in Syria, Jerusalem, Armenia, and elsewhere negotiated agreements with Muslim authorities whereby remaining Christian communities were guaranteed the right to practice their religion, largely in private, in return for payment of a special tax. Much depended on the attitudes of local Muslim rulers. On occasion, churches were destroyed, villages plundered, fields burned, and Christians forced to wear distinctive clothing. By contrast, a wave of church building took place in Syria under Muslim rule, and the Christians were recruited into the administration, schools, translation services, and even the armed forces of the Arab Empire. In 649, only 15 years after Damascus had been conquered by Arab forces, an Nestorian bishop wrote, "These Arabs fight not against our Christian religion. Nay, rather they defend our faith. They revere our priests and saints, and they make gifts to our churches and monasteries." Thus the Nestorian Christian communities of Syria, Iraq, and Persia, sometimes called the Church of the East, survived the assault of Islam, but they did so as shrinking communities of second-class subjects, regulated minorities forbidden from propagating their message to Muslims. They also abandoned their religious paintings and sculptures, fearing to offend Muslims, who generally objected to any artistic representation of the divine. But further east, a small and highly creative Nestorian church, initiated in 635 by a Persian missionary monk, had taken root in China with the approval of the country's Tang Dynasty rulers. Both its art and literature articulated the Christian message using Buddhist and Taoist concepts. The written texts themselves, known as the Jesus Sutras, refer to Christianity as the religion of light from the West, or the luminous religion. They described God as the cool wind, sin as bad karma, and a good life as one of no desire and no action. People can live only by dwelling in the living breath of God, the Jesus Sutras declare. All the Buddhas are moved by this wind, which blows everywhere in the world. The contraction of this remarkable experiment owed little to Islam, but derived rather from the vagaries of Chinese politics. In the mid-9th century, the Chinese state turned against all religions of foreign origin, Islam and Buddhism, as well as Christianity. Wholly dependent on the goodwill of Chinese authorities, this small outpost of Christianity withered. Later, the Mongol conquest of China in the 13th century offered a brief opportunity for Christianity's renewal, as the religiously tolerant Mongols welcomed Nestorian Christians, as well as people of various other faiths. A number of prominent Mongols became Christians, including one of the wives of Chinggis Khan. Considering Jesus a powerful shaman, Mongols also appreciated that Christians, unlike Buddhists, could eat meat, and unlike Muslims, could drink alcohol, even including it in their worship. But Mongol rule was short, ending in 1368, and the small number of Chinese Christians ensured that the faith almost completely vanished with the advent of the vigorously Confucian Ming dynasty. African Christianity. The churches of Africa, like those of the Middle East and Asia, also found themselves on the defensive and declining in the face of an expanding Islam. Across coastal North Africa, widespread conversion to Islam over several centuries reduced to virtual extinction Christian communities that had earlier provided many of the martyrs and intellectuals of the early church. In Egypt, however, Christianity had become the religion of the majority by the time of the Muslim conquest around 640, and for the next 500 years or so, large numbers continued to speak Coptic and practice their religion as dhimmis, legally inferior or protected people paying a special tax under relatively tolerant Muslim rulers. Many found Arab government less oppressive than that of their former Byzantine overlords, who considered Egyptian Christians heretics. By the 13th century, things changed dramatically as Christian crusaders from Europe and Mongol invaders from the east threatened Egypt. In these circumstances, the country's Muslim rulers came to suspect the political loyalty of their Christian subjects. The mid-14th century witnessed violent anti-Christian pogroms, destruction of churches, and the forced removal of Christians from the best land. Many felt like exiles in their own country. As a result, most rural Egyptians converted to Islam and moved toward the use of Arabic rather than Coptic, which largely died out. Although Egypt was becoming an Arab and Muslim country, a substantial Christian minority persisted among the literate in urban areas and in monasteries located in remote regions. In the early 21st century, Egyptian Christians still numbered about 10% of the population. Even as Egyptian Christianity was contracting, a new center of African Christianity was taking shape during the 5th and 6th centuries in the several kingdoms of Nubia to the south of Egypt, where the faith had been introduced by Egyptian traders and missionaries. Parts of the Bible were translated into the Nubian language, while other writings appeared in Greek, Arabic, and the Ethiopian language of Ge'ez. A great cathedral in the Nubian city of Faras was decorated with magnificent murals, and the earlier practice of burying servants to provide for rulers in the afterlife stopped abruptly. At times, kings served as priests, and Christian bishops held state offices. By the mid-7th century, both the ruling class and many commoners had become Christian. At the same time, Nubian armies twice defeated Arab incursions, and following these defeats, an agreement with the Muslim Egypt protected this outpost of Christianity for some 600 years. But pressures mounted in the 13th and 14th centuries, as Egypt adopted a more hostile stance toward Christians, while Islamized tribes from the desert and Arab migrants pushed against Nubia. By 1500, Nubian Christianity, like its counterparts in coastal North Africa, had largely disappeared. An important exception to these various contractions of Asian and African Christianity lay in Ethiopia. There, the rulers of Aksum had adopted Christianity in the 4th century, and it subsequently took root among the general population as well. Over the centuries of Islamic expansion, Ethiopia became a Christian island in a Muslim sea, protected by its mountainous geography and its distance from major centers of Islamic power. Many Muslims also remembered gratefully that Christian Ethiopia had sheltered some of the beleaguered and persecuted followers of Muhammad in Islam's early years. Nonetheless, the spread of Islam largely cut Ethiopia off from other parts of Christendom and rendered its position in Northeast Africa precarious. In its isolated location, Ethiopian Christianity developed some of its most distinctive features. One of these was a fascination with Judaism and Jerusalem, reflected in a much-told story about the visit of an Ethiopian queen of Sheba to King Solomon. The story includes an episode in which Solomon seduces the queen, producing a child who becomes the founding monarch of the Ethiopian state. Since Solomon figures in the line of descent to Jesus, it meant that Ethiopia's Christian rulers could legitimate their position by tracing their ancestry to Jesus himself. Furthermore, Ethiopian monks long maintained a presence in Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre, said to mark the site where Jesus was crucified and buried. Then in the 12th century, the rulers of a new Ethiopian dynasty constructed a remarkable series of 12 linked underground churches, apparently attempting to create a new Jerusalem on Christian Ethiopian soil, as the original city lay under Muslim control. Those churches are in use to this day in modern Ethiopia, where over 60% of the country's population retains an affiliation with this ancient Christian church.